The United States Postal Service has been around for a really long time. In fact, it's the oldest continuously operated federal service in the country. But what was it like to use back when it first started? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. Back in the 1790s, if you wanted to send something through the post office, it was actually much more difficult than it is today. For one thing, there weren't any set delivery times or schedules. You could just go into the post office and expect your letter to arrive in a few days like you can today. Instead, mail was delivered on an irregular basis, whenever the stagecoach arrived from the next town over, and sometimes the mail didn't even get delivered for weeks at a time. For another, back then, the post offices were run by the people who lived above them. The postmaster of a town was typically a local business owner or politician who volunteered for the job. They were given a commission by the President of the United States, and they served without pay. Since the postmasters were volunteers, they often had other duties that they needed to attend to first, so they might not have gotten around to sorting the mail for days or even weeks at a time. But perhaps the biggest challenge of all was the lack of infrastructure. Back then, there were very few roads and almost no bridges. Most towns were only accessible by horseback or on foot, and this made it incredibly difficult for the postal service to deliver mail on time. Stagecoaches were often delayed by bad weather or broken axles, and this meant that the mail would often be held up for days or even weeks at a time. So if you wanted to send something through the post office in the 1790s, you had to be very patient. It could take a long time for your letter to arrive, but eventually it would get there. Eventually. Before we get into how mail was sorted, let's talk about what it was like to work in a post office during this time period. As we mentioned before, most postmasters were volunteers who had other jobs that they needed to attend to first. This meant that the post office often took second place to other duties, and this caused a lot of frustration for both the postmasters and the people who needed to use the postal service. However, despite the challenges, many people saw serving as a postmaster as an honor. It was a chance to serve their community and the country, and they were proud to do it. Additionally, there were some perks to the job. For example, postmasters were allowed to keep any money that came through the post office that wasn't claimed. This included things like unclaimed wages, insurance money, and even prize money from lotteries. So while being a postmaster wasn't exactly a full-time job, it did come with some unique benefits. Now that we know what it was like to work in a post office during this time period, let's talk about what it was like for the people who used the postal service. As we mentioned before, mail delivery was very slow and unreliable. This was especially frustrating for people who were expecting important news or shipments. Imagine, for example, you're a farmer who is expecting a shipment of seeds in the spring so you can plant your crops. If the shipment is delayed because of bad weather or a broken axle, it could throw off your planting schedule and potentially ruin your harvest. Despite the challenges, the people of the 1790s relied heavily on the postal service. It was one of the best ways to communicate over long distances, and it was often the only way to receive important news or shipments. People would often have to make multiple trips to the post office each week just to check if their mail had arrived. And when it did arrive, it would often be a mix of letters, newspapers, and circulars. There was no such thing as junk mail back then, but people did receive a lot of unwanted mail. Circulars and advertisements made up a large percentage of the mail. and these often had to be sorted through before you could get to your actual mail. Today, we're so used to getting our mail delivered quickly and efficiently. We can send a letter from one side of the country to the other, and it will arrive within a few days. But this wasn't always the case. In the early days of the U.S. Postal Service, mail delivery was slow and unreliable. But despite the challenges, the people of the 1790s made it work. They relied on the Postal Service to communicate with family and friends, to receive important news, and to get their mail. And they were willing to put up with the challenges because they knew that it was one of the best ways to stay connected. As we said, in the early days of the U.S. Postal Service, mail delivery was slow and unreliable. But despite the challenges, the people of the 1790s made it work. They relied on the Postal Service to communicate with family and friends, to receive important news, and to get their mail. And they were willing to put up with the challenges because they knew that it was one of the best ways to stay connected. One of the biggest challenges of delivering mail in the 1790s was the lack of infrastructure. Back then, there were very few roads and almost no bridges. This made it difficult for mail carriers to travel from town to town and deliver the mail on time. Additionally, most towns were only accessible by horseback or on foot. This meant that carriers had to travel on foot through all kinds of weather to deliver the mail. Another challenge was the lack of a standard delivery schedule. Unlike today, there were no set delivery times or routes. Mail carriers would often have to wait for the stagecoach to arrive from the next town over before they could deliver the mail. This meant that people did know when their mail would arrive, and they often had to wait for weeks at a time. Despite these challenges, mail carriers played an essential role in the early U.S. Postal Service. They were responsible for delivering the mail to every household in their area, regardless of the weather or the time of day. Mail carriers were often the first people to arrive in a town in the morning and the last people to leave in the evening. They would often walk for miles each day, carrying heavy sacks of mail on their back. It wasn't all bad though. Being a mail carrier in the 1790s did have its perks. For one thing, carriers were given free postage on all of the mail that they carried. This meant that they could send letters and packages anywhere in the country without having to pay for postage. Additionally, carriers were often given food and lodging by the people whose mail they delivered. This meant that they didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from or where they would sleep at night. Perhaps the best part of being a mail carrier in the 1790s was the sense of community. Carriers were often the only people who visited a particular household on a regular basis. This meant that they were able to build relationships with the people they delivered the mail to. They would often be the first to hear about births, deaths, and marriages in a town, and they were often invited to social events. In conclusion, being a mail carrier in the 1790s was a challenging but rewarding job. Carriers played an essential role in the early U.S. Postal Service, and they were responsible for delivering the mail to every household in their area. Despite the challenges, the job had its perks, and carriers were often given free postage, food, and lodging. Perhaps the best part of the job was the sense of community that came with it. Carriers were often the only people who visited a particular household on a regular basis, and they were able to build relationships with the people they delivered the mail to. All right, guys, that's a look at what the post office was like back in the 1790s. What did you think? Did you know that it worked like that? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.